On September 2nd of the 31 BC year, the naval forces of Marcus Antonius and Caesar Divi Filius confronted one another in a clash known as the Battle of Actium. Antonius was accompanied by Cleopatra, a queen with a mind of her own, whose solo performance complicated battle matters for her lover. Seizing the opportunity to escape through a gap that had formed between the opposing ships, Cleopatra launched her royal vessel, called the Antonius, leading approximately 60 to 90 ships packed full of legions out and onto the open sea. In response, Antonius quickly transferred to a smaller, faster vessel, aiming to join Cleopatra. Once he was safely aboard her ship, the Antonius hoisted its distinctive purple sails and headed for the Peloponnesus. In a heartbeat, Antonius had just abandoned his loyal legions, leaving more than 100 of his ships to carry on the battle with no commander. Is it any wonder that Marcus Antonius refused to see or speak with Cleopatra, choosing instead to remain isolated on the deck of the Antonius for the entirety of the following 3-day voyage? But by the time the renegade fleet finally anchored at Taenarum in modern-day Cape Matapan, Cleopatra's handmaidens, Iris and Charmaine, had cajoled Antonius into speaking with the runaway queen. The details of their private exchange remain private, yet the fleet launched once more to sea with Cleopatra and Antonius somehow reconciled. From Taenarum, they voyaged across the Mediterranean and landed at Paratonion, modern-day Mersamatru, in Egypt. At Paratonion, Cleopatra and Antonius parted ways. Taking 2 legions with him, Antonius headed westward towards Cyrene, where he had 4 more legions in reserve, stationed under his ally, Lucius Pinarius. Cleopatra assumed command of the remainder of the legions, sailing eastward towards Alexandria, from whence she would secure their allies and await the arrival of Antonius's land legions from Actium under the command of Publius Canidius Crassus. Concerned that unfavorable news of the events at Actium might reach her enemies and embolden her political opposition to instigate a rebellion, Cleopatra staged her arrival at Alexandria's harbor in such a way as to dramatically announce Egypt's great victory at Actium. But it would not take long before the truth was widely known, and Cleopatra desperately needed every bit of that time to solidify her alliances. Still, no amount of time could change the fact that the queen's allies were no longer reliable. When Marcus Antonius had first negotiated Egypt's alliance with King Artavasdes I of Media Atropatene, he had gifted a portion of Armenian territory to the king, as well as betrothing his son, Alexander Helios, to the king's daughter, Eotapa, whom Antonius then conveniently laid hold of as a royal hostage. In order to better secure Media Atropatene's border against Parthian attack, Antonius had swapped several of his well-trained Roman legions for the legions of Media Atropatene. However, when Marcus Antonius then recalled his Roman legions from the east for transportation to Greece, he failed to return Media Atropatene's native legions to King Artavasdes I, instead seizing them to bolster his own Greek forces, while leaving King Artavasdes I defenseless. Thinking to demonstrate that Egypt still honored its alliance with Media Atropatene, Cleopatra ordered the immediate execution of King Artavasdes II of Armenia, who was still in Egyptian custody and who was the bitter enemy of Artavasdes I. Hoping also to further please Media Atropatene's king, Cleopatra proudly sent him the dead Armenian king's head as a gift, likely in conjunction with a subtle reminder that his young daughter, the Princess Eotapa, still remained a hostage in Cleopatra's court. Cleopatra's gift, however, was wasted. Artaxias, the son of Armenia's now decapitated King Artavasdes II, had been forced to flee to the arms of King Phraates of Parthia after his past failed attempt to rescue his father from the clutches of Marcus Antonius. With Media Atropatene now emptied of its Roman legions by order of Antonius, leaving King Artavasdes I fully exposed, Antonius had graciously paved the way for Artaxias, supported by Parthian troops, to invade Media Atropatene, take Artavasdes I prisoner, and happily hand him over to King Phraates of Parthia. To make matters worse, Marcus Antonius returned from Cyrene a broken man. Antonius came back without the additional 4 legions he had intended to acquire from Lucius Pinarius, then promptly withdrew from everyone. The Queen of Egypt likely got the story from his men. Before Marcus Antonius had arrived in Cyrene, he had dispatched messengers to Lucius Pinarius, informing his ally that he was coming to collect his legions. But Lucius Pinarius, having already heard the shocking account of Antonius and Cleopatra's flight from the Battle of Actium, sentencing the abandoned Roman legions to almost certain death by their negligence, executed Antonius's messengers and then closed the city's gates. Lucius Pinarius, who was a grand-nephew of the divine Julius Caesar, chose to defect from Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra and to give to his cousin, Caesar Divi Filius, those 4 legions that Antonius had expected to collect. And although Marcus Antonius tried to besiege the town, he now had only half as many men as Lucius Pinarius and met with dismal failure. Upon the defection of Lucius Pinarius, Marcus Antonius attempted to commit suicide by falling on his sword, but was persuaded against it by his officers, who encouraged him, rather, to return to Alexandria and regroup with the queen. But when Antonius arrived in Alexandria, he simply ordered the construction of a small hut on Pharos Island alongside Alexandria's great lighthouse. Naming his tiny hut the Timonian, after Timon of Athens, whose philosophical cynicism and complete distrust of human beings now mirrored his own, the thoroughly downcast and depressed general Marcus Antonius entered his hut, withdrawing from all human contact, including Cleopatra. When Publius Canidius Crassus finally arrived in Alexandria with the information that Antonius's land legions had surrendered to Caesar Divi Filius just days after the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra began to plan. Making the necessary arrangements for her son, the 17-year-old Ptolemy Caesar, to assume her throne as sole king of Egypt, Cleopatra commenced preparations for a long journey. She transferred a portion of her royal Egyptian fleet from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, where she could more easily escape to a distant shore. Whether Cleopatra meant to go it alone, or whether she planned to take Marcus Antonius with her is not known, but obviously Cleopatra's chickens had come home to roost. Like King Herod of Judea, who had been divested of parts of the Levant when Marcus Antonius had granted those territories to Cleopatra, Malichus I, king of the Nabateans, had also forfeited prime real estate in Aqaba along the Red Sea, stripped from him by Marcus Antonius as yet another gift for Cleopatra. And also like King Herod, Malichus I made excuses for not accompanying Marcus Antonius to Greece before the fateful Battle of Actium, depriving the Roman general of Nabatean forces. With the tide now decidedly turning, Malichus set fire to Cleopatra's fleet on the Red Sea, thus preventing the queen's escape from Egypt. King Herod of Judea, after sending Antonius a private letter urging the general to betray Cleopatra and throw himself on the mercy of Caesar, then followed his own advice. Herod left Judea and marched north towards Anatolia, where Caesar Divi Filius was busy either outright eliminating the former allies of Antonius or negotiating new terms with them. With Judea no longer a buffer, and 4 legions from Cyrene now fighting under the banner of Caesar Divi Filius, who was making his way through Anatolia and Syria, Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, was trapped. As enemy legions from 2 different directions joined in a coordinated march towards Alexandria, she now had no choice but to await her day of reckoning. Eventually, Cleopatra succeeded in luring Marcus Antonius from his self-imposed exile on Pharos Island. In contrast to the Society of Inimitable Livers, the self-styled private drinking club in which she and Antonius had reveled during his first visit to Alexandria almost a decade earlier, Cleopatra now formed a follow-up club, which she called the Society of Companions in Death. Much like their earlier club, the queen and her consort, along with a select group of friends, feasted by day and drank by night, although with a far more somber and reflective attitude. As if arranging a parting bequest to their loyal companions, Antonius's birthday became the occasion for lavishing gifts of such extravagance on their guests that many who arrived poor went away from the party suddenly wealthy. But perhaps Cleopatra also meant for the event to be a parting tribute to Antonius, as by contrast, she completely downplayed her own birthday. As Cleopatra and Antonius waited out the arrival of Caesar's forces, they passed the time with banquets which feigned festivity in the midst of gloom and solemnity, and simultaneously made plans for the future of Egypt. Cleopatra's son, Ptolemy Caesar, and Antonius's son, the 16-year-old Marcus Antonius Antyllus, were both admitted to the Ephebi class of Egyptian society, a class similar to the knight class of the Greeks, marking their formal recognition as young men fit to begin military and administrative training in readiness for their future lives. As Pharaoh of Egypt, the religious title Egypt's sacred priests had withheld from her father and brother, Cleopatra would have followed the pharaonic custom of preparing her burial tomb. During this indeterminate period of waiting, it is likely Cleopatra sought to speed up the process of constructing her royal tomb, suddenly concerned about the certainty of its completion. With the hope of saving her children, Cleopatra deluged Caesar Divi Filius with largesse and letters. She proposed that in exchange for allowing her children to inherit Egypt, which they would then govern on Caesar's behalf as a province of Rome, Cleopatra would provide Caesar an extravagant pension which would guarantee his place at the top of Roman politics for the rest of his life. She also appealed to him for mercy on behalf of Marcus Antonius, that Antonius be allowed to live out the rest of his life with her in Alexandria, as an exile, divested of any political office or military power. Otherwise, threatened Cleopatra, she would set fire to herself and vast amounts of her treasures within her newly constructed mausoleum before Caesar Divi Filius could reach Alexandria to lay his hands on it. In response, Cleopatra was soon after visited by Thyrsos, one of Caesar's eastern diplomats, who quietly advised the Egyptian queen that she could purchase her own life from Caesar Divi Filius by executing Marcus Antonius, or casting him out of Egypt. After being stripped and flogged by Antonius himself, Thyrsos was sent back to Caesar with no deal. By the spring of 30 BC, Caesar had reached Phoenicia. There, in the city of Ptolemais, Caesar's forces were offered fresh supplies by his new ally, King Herod of Judea, after which he continued marching towards Alexandria. As Caesar's forces took the town of Pelusium in early summer, Marcus Antonius, who had marched his forces out to face the oncoming legions from Cyrene, was defeated at the town of Paratonion and forced to retreat back to Alexandria. By the end of July, Caesar's legions had reached Alexandria. Marcus Antonius led his forces against Caesar, fighting a battle outside the city's hippodrome, where Antonius gained a minor victory. From outside the city, Antonius returned at once to the palace, where he enthusiastically kissed Cleopatra before ceremoniously presenting to her one of his soldiers who had fought most bravely. Cleopatra rewarded the legionary with a golden breastplate and helmet, but such rewards from a foreign queen were meaningless to Roman soldiers who fought for honor, as represented by laurel wreaths, toques, and armbands awarded to them by a proud and victorious general. The legionary accepted Cleopatra's Medal of Valor with grace. However, in the middle of the night, the man defected to the camp of Caesar, the very same enemy against whom he had fought so bravely. On July 31st, Antonius feasted with his men in anticipation of the morrow's battle, which he had strategized into a two-pronged attack by both land and by sea. Stationing his infantry and cavalry atop a hill, Marcus Antonius watched as his ships sailed towards those of Caesar to begin the invasion, after which his infantry and cavalry would charge. But, as Antonius looked on, his naval fleet stopped. His men, positioned along the decks, saluted Caesar's men, who then saluted in return. After this telling incident, Antonius's infantry and cavalry deserted him, following suit with his naval forces in defecting to Caesar Divi Filius. When Cleopatra learned of the surrender of Antonius's forces, she hastily arranged to have her son, Ptolemy Caesar, spirited away by his tutor, Rhodon, along with a large chest of gold, before retreating into her mausoleum with her attendants, Iris and Charmian, and a single eunuch, whereupon she sealed the doors. From her mausoleum, which she had previously filled with vast amounts of Egyptian gold and other treasures, Cleopatra issued orders that word be sent to Marcus Antonius, informing him that she had committed suicide and urging him to do the same. Plutarch tells us that when Marcus Antonius received the message that Cleopatra was dead, he cried out,
"Why delay now, Antonius? Fortuna has taken away thy sole remaining excuse for clinging to life. O Cleopatra, I am not grieved to be bereft of thee, for I shall straightway join thee. But I am grieved that such an imperator as I am has been found to be inferior to a woman in courage."
Marcus Antonius then removed his breastplate. Laying it aside, he ordered his slave, Eros, to slay him. Eros drew his sword, raised it, but at the last moment turned away his face and slew himself instead. As Eros fell, Marcus Antonius said,
"Well done, Eros. Though thou wast not able to do it thyself, thou teachest me what I must do."
Marcus Antonius then picked up the sword and ran himself through the belly, falling down onto the couch. Tragically, the wound failed to kill him, leaving Marcus Antonius partially disemboweled and in the greatest agony. When word reached Cleopatra that Antonius still lived, she ordered him to be brought to her mausoleum at once. Amazed that Cleopatra was also still alive, not dead, Marcus Antonius insisted on entering her tomb, but Cleopatra would not unseal the doors. From an opening above, she lowered ropes down to Antonius, then, aided only by Iris and Charmian, Cleopatra pulled Marcus Antonius up towards the opening. Plutarch describes the scene as pitiable by writing,
"Smeared with blood and struggling with death, he was drawn up, stretching out his hands to her even as he dangled in the air."
After a lengthy struggle, the three women, with faces strained and hands clinging to the ropes, finally succeeded in pulling Marcus Antonius up and into the mausoleum. There, Cleopatra rent her garments over Antonius as she beat her breasts and tore at her flesh. Weeping over him, her face now smeared with his blood, the hysterical Cleopatra called Marcus Antonius master, husband, and imperator. Shushing her lamentations, Antonius asked for a cup of wine. After drinking down the contents of the cup that was quickly pressed into his hands, Antonius advised Cleopatra to look after her own safety if she could do so without disgrace. He also advised Cleopatra to trust only Gaius Proculus from among Caesar's companions, as Marcus Antonius knew Proculus to be a trustworthy and honorable man. Before he drew his last breath, Marcus Antonius bade Cleopatra,
"Do not lament me, but count me happy for the good things that were mine. I became most illustrious of men. I won the greatest power, and now my defeat is not counted against me as ignoble."
Marcus Antonius was a Roman, able to be conquered only by another Roman.